Welcome to the Spot On Insurance Podcast, brought to you by Insurance Licensing Services of America, ILSA. This is Arlene Tavares.
And this is Ted Tavares coming to you from Puerto Rico. In this episode, we'll be getting insight from one of the top regulatory attorneys in our industry.
But before we begin, remember to click on the subscribe button so you don't miss a single episode. And now here's our host, Doug Foresta.
Welcome. This is Doug Foresta. My guest today is Todd Martin. He is a partner in the law firm of Stinson Leonard Street. Today, we're going to be talking about the Affordable Care Act behind the soundbites, the ACA. And Todd Martin regularly advises insurers, third-party administrators, brokers, and employers on healthcare regulatory issues, including the Affordable Care Act and other state and federal laws and regulations. Todd, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Doug.
Thanks. So let's start off with, and we're talking about the ACA today, the Affordable Care Act. Before we get into all the other things, the first question I want to ask you is, can you say a little bit about what, maybe the 10,000 foot view of what is the ACA? How long is it? What is included in it? I think that would be really helpful for our listeners to get a sense of.
Sure. So one thing to keep in mind about the ACA is it is a very lengthy set of laws and regulations that primarily govern health insurance, and of that primarily are focused on the individual health insurance market. But the law itself is contained in thousands of pages of legislation and regulation that deal with a whole host of issues relating to health insurance and the health insurance marketplace.
And one of the things that you said to me prior to our recording that I really thought was very interesting was you said the Affordable Care Act is not a health care act. It is a health insurance act, correct?
Right. So the focus of the vast majority of the mandates focus on health coverage, health plans. So governing things like whether health insurance plans can have pre-existing condition limitations and the coverages that are mandated in the marketplace, and regulation on health insurers. Generally, there isn't a lot of the law that really focuses on health care itself. So,
Todd, I know that the ACA overlaps with existing state regulation of health insurance. Can you say a little bit about the interplay of the regulations within the ACA and then the existing state regulation?
Sure. So before the ACA, insurance was primarily regulated at the state level. There were a few federal aspects like HIPAA, for example, but the majority of regulation of health insurance was done at the state level. Now the ACA added a very large and comprehensive set of mandates and requirements on top of existing state law, and in some cases those requirements preempted existing state law. So it's the ACA that applies, and the prior inconsistent state law doesn't apply at all. And then in some cases, it overlaps with state law. So, for example, there are a number of coverage mandates that each state has for its insurance that's issued there that are still in place. And then insurance companies themselves, their solvency and oversight of their corporate requirements is still done at the state level.
So, in other words, the ACA does not cover the entire field of insurance regulation, then?
Right. It's kind of a dual jurisdiction where there are mandates at the federal level, and there are some aspects of things that are governed by federal law and federal agencies, and there are other aspects of insurance law and regulation that are still regulated at the state level.
I know that obviously all types of health care plans or health plans were impacted by the ACA, including the individual, small group, the large group, and self-funded. But can you say a little bit about, first of all, were some of those groups more impacted than others, and maybe how they're impacted?
Yeah, so the largest impact of the ACA was the individual market. So prior to the passage of the ACA, the individual insurance market was regulated at the state level, and it was generally structured where there were underwriting requirements. So in order to get an individual health insurance policy, someone had to submit an application and be accepted into coverage. For those individuals who weren't eligible for coverage because of health issues or other issues, there was a state high-risk pool in most states that would provide coverage outside of the individual market. The ACA changed that and made all individual health insurance policies subject to guaranteed issue, no pre-existing condition limitations, and then the requirements for aggregating risk within regions. The biggest impact was in that group of policies. There are a number of impacts that applied to the small group market as well, but there was already a fairly comprehensive set of laws at the state level governing small group health insurance that included, for example, requirements for guaranteed issue. And so the impacts on the small group market weren't as great. And then the large group market was probably impacted the least of those three. There are some mandates for coverage, like the age 26 dependent requirement, but HIPAA already mandated no restrictions on pre-existing conditions within those requirements. And for the large group, or large employers, I should say, the biggest impact of the ACA is the large employer mandate that says that if you're a large employer over 50 and you don't provide health insurance for your employees, then there can be a penalty for that. There were already some states that had large employer mandates and some local communities that had that, but that wasn't a national requirement before the ACA.
And then, as of this recording, I know that's one of the debates I think that's going on, right? About as we look at different parts of the ACA, and we're going to talk about perspective in a minute, but I think that's one of the ones that's probably fair to say that employers don't love necessarily. Right.
That certainly is one of the issues that's being debated. Should large employers be required to provide some level of coverage or pay a penalty or not? And that's one of the the issue that's being discussed and has been discussed since the passage of the ACA.
Now, one of the things that I hope is clear to the listener in this is that this podcast is not about is the ACA good or bad. It's important to understand what it is and to understand the perspectives on each side about whether to keep it, change it. And so, with that idea of perspective and keeping perspective in mind, can you say a little bit about the different perspectives on the ACA and maybe a little bit about what the outcome of those perspectives would be in terms of changes in the regulation?
Sure. So I think one of the challenges in this whole debate is that so much of what's being reported and discussed is around sound bites and not the substantive issues behind those. And I think there are some significant issues that are behind the debate and should really be the focus of discussion on what's the best policy for health insurance regulations. So another issue is the extent to which the lower risk individuals should be subsidizing higher risk individuals. So in some senses, that's how insurance works. The healthy individuals in the pool subsidize the sick individuals in the pool, and in some sense, that's the way insurance should work. So if I'm healthy today, what I get back from the insurance is less than what I put in, but I could become sick at any time, and at that time, then I would get getting more back from the insurance that I'm spending on the premium. But there's a broader issue, and it has to do with risk, pooling. So should someone who is young and healthy pay the same for their premiums as someone who's much older and has a higher risk? So that's an important piece of this debate. Another issue is the concept of simplifying things. So one of the concepts in the Affordable Care Act is to try and make things more standardized and simpler. So, for example, in the individual market, we have these metal levels. A bronze plan covers a certain percentage, 60% generally, versus silver and gold, and then standardization around, what needs to be included in the coverage, what the out-of-pocket maximums are, and so on. There's a counterpoint to that to say there should be more choice and options for structuring coverage, and there shouldn't be so many mandates that narrow those choices. And then another big issue is, as it relates to choice, is the issue about whether someone should be able to choose whether to buy insurance or not. So one of the controversial issues in the ACA is the individual mandate, where individuals have to buy insurance or pay a penalty. And so the counterpoint to that is that individuals should be able to choose whether to buy insurance or not. And then another corollary to that is if you allow individuals to not buy insurance, then what happens if they become sick in the future? Can they just not pay for insurance while they're healthy, and then just start paying for insurance when they're sick? So that's called adverse selection, and it's an issue that needs to be dealt with when you think about insurance policy.
I would imagine that becomes a big problem for insurers, right? Right.
It's really a cost issue. It's another way to think about it is freeloading, essentially. So while I'm healthy, I don't spend anything, but then the minute I become sick, then I pay a premium. The burden of that falls on all of the other insureds who didn't do that.
Spot on Insurance is sponsored by ILSA, Insurance Licensing Services of America, America's premier licensing and regulatory compliance experts. To learn more about ILSA and the services they provide, visit ilsainc.com. Is there a perspective that says, the federal government shouldn't really be in the business of regulating insurance at all, and it should just be a state and individual issue?
Yes, and that's one of the issues that is dividing the GOP debate on this right now. So some would say insurance really should be regulated at the state and local level because it really is a local or a regional issue, and the states are in a better position to regulate insurance than the federal government. Then others would say this concept of having uniformity across all the states and mandates across the states is beneficial, and the federal government should be stepping in because this is a fundamental issue and it should apply uniformly across the country.
One of the things that I think is pretty clear as we listen to this is that these are complex issues, right? These are issues where there may not be a simple answer. And I know you said that one of the things that's difficult is, as we're talking about today, this is, beyond the sound bites. Can you say a little bit about the challenge of moving legislation like this and resolving healthcare policies that are complex in a political environment? And I don't mean partisan political. I just mean through the political process.
Right. Well, the issues that we're dealing with are complex, and there are lots of issues that if you change this, it also impacts this. And so you've got to have a really comprehensive understanding of the insurance marketplace, of health insurance costs, in general, and all of these issues. I mean, we have thousands of pages of legislation and regulation that are the, Affordable Care Act, with thousands of issues, underneath those. And And so, the challenge in dealing with these in a partisan context is, number one, complete understanding of what these issues are, and if you push on this, then how does it impact something else? And then the challenge of really coming together to solve a challenging problem here, and this is one of those issues where the real solution does require cooperation, and so that can be challenging in a political environment.
So obviously this is a podcast about insurance, but one of the things that I know that you said is, there's a lot of discussion about reining in the cost of health insurance through insurance regulation, but maybe not as much conversation about the actual cost of health care. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about that, the impact of healthcare costs on health insurance and on the insurance market in general.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges in this whole debate is, I think what's behind a lot of what the public is focused on is the cost of health insurance, and the main component of the cost of health insurance is the cost of health care. So if you look at what the ACA does, the ACA focuses on health insurance and really focuses on a particular problem, and that is getting people covered. But it doesn't focus as much on the issue of rising health care costs. And so you can do a lot of things to look at the ACA and change the way that health insurance is regulated. If you don't deal with the issue of health care costs, then you won't be able to address the issue of health insurance costs, because the primary driver of health insurance costs is the cost of health care.
So I have a question for you that may not be the easiest to answer, but one of the things that comes to mind is, why do you think we're not having as much of that conversation about the cost of healthcare itself?
I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is dealing with the cost of healthcare is incredibly difficult. Think about all of the things that go into healthcare costs, some of which are controllable and some of which are not so much. So an aging population is a factor, of course, that you can't control. There are other aspects, medical technology gains and how that impacts cost, and then the whole concept of how healthcare is delivered and paid for. Those are really big issues to get your arms around. And so, the solution to that, those issues in terms of dealing with healthcare costs are really difficult to deal with at the political level. And so I think the focus has gone to, health insurance. And I think in part with the thought that if you control the payors, then those payors can help, control healthcare costs. But there really hasn't been a lot of direct focus on the issue of healthcare cost.
Before I ask you about solutions, and I know you're going to solve the ACA for us today, which is great. I'm just kidding.
Yep, I got the silver bullet right here.
All right, excellent. Yep, we'll have to wait till the end to hear this. I did want to ask you the question of so obviously we talked about the perspective of, the need for change. Is there a perspective that everything is fine and we just leave it as it is? Or are there structural problems within the ACA or issues that definitely need to be addressed, regardless of what we do, but that we need to do something?
The ACA caused a fundamental shift in the way that the health insurance marketplace worked. So in the past, there was underwriting, and the costs of that were reined in by essentially bringing individuals who were healthier and excluding those who aren't. And so there's a number of factors here that are causing stress on the individual marketplace, and that's resulted in a number of things, including some large insurers pulling out of the individual marketplace because of cost issues, because of uncertainty, and the individual marketplace is a fundamental piece, to this whole puzzle. Not everyone can get health insurance through their large employer plan or through their small employer plan. Individuals may be self-employed, or does not have access to those other, coverage options. And so if the individual market fails in the sense that the cost becomes or grows really significantly, such that you have a mass exodus, from it, that's not good for anyone. And so there really needs to be a focus on this whole concept of stabilizing, the individual market and making sure that there are options available for individuals who are going to get coverage, through that individual market that are similar to the costs that are in place in the small group market and in the large group market.
So that starts to answer the question, the last question I was going to ask you, which is about the, I'm not going to say if you were in charge of healthcare, what would you do? But I will ask you, where do you think the solutions lie? What do we need to be focusing on in order to make progress, with this issue?
So as it relates to the ACA, I think the first issue is focusing on the individual market and making sure that we have stability in it. And most likely that's going to require some support of it, some cost shifting elements. And there were some of those things in the ACA that shifted, burdens from insurers who had higher risk populations to those who had, lower risk populations. Some of those have phased out, and I think we need to have a look again at, how we stabilize the marketplace. But then I think the next, issue that really needs to get focused on is the issue of rising healthcare costs. And you can debate, about, some of these, insurance issues, but if you don't get focused on the issue of rising healthcare costs, then these are going to be, small issues as it relates to the overall cost of health insurance.
And just, I guess just one last follow-up piece. I wonder if you can speak to this. There's oftentimes people have the perception that health insurance drives up health care costs, but I think you said that it's actually quite the opposite. Is that right?
Sure. So you start by what piece of the overall cost of health insurance is related to the insurance itself. And there's some different numbers that are thrown out there, but in general, it's going to be less than 10% under anybody's numbers. So it's a small piece of the overall issue. And so you can squeeze insurers and you say, well, we're going to try and squeeze money out of the system, and that's what one of the goals of the ACA was to make the insurance process more efficient. But there's only so much you can squeeze out of that. And to the extent that you squeeze insurers to the extent that they become unprofitable, that's not good for anyone either, because insurers need to be stable and have surplus in order to pay claims. And so there's only so much you can squeeze there. And again, if you're focusing on health insurance costs, what you need to focus on is the big piece of that, which is healthcare costs.
My guest today has been Todd Martin. He is a partner in the law firm of Stinson Leonard Street. Todd, if people want to learn more about this topic, or they want to learn more about you or Stinson Leonard, where should we send them today?
You can send them to our website, www.stinson.com. And we also have available an Affordable Care Act status chart that we would make available to your listeners if they'd like, that outline a lot of the key mandates and developments in those areas.
That would be great. Absolutely. Todd Martin, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your words of wisdom on this important topic.
Thank you.
By the way, our show notes and bonus resources can be found on spotoninsurance.com. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single episode.
Thanks for joining us.